Hey everybody, this is James Griffin. I'm teaching from Hilton Head Island, South Carolina, and we're talking about the Cold War. So there's a lot to cover. This is in period 8 that we're working on. The question I have for you for this section, which on the calendar date it's actually March the 10th. Now we had class that day, but let's talk about what this is. The question for that day, which I'm going to address in this video, is how did U.S. foreign policy change to contain communist power after 1945? This is what I call a 5 by 5 by 5 question. Name 5 Americans who led in the Cold War before 1980. Name 5 countries which were threatened. And name 5 events or conflicts of the Cold War. So we're actually going to start with the tail end of that. But let's start real briefly. The 5 leaders I want to discuss today would be Harry Truman and George Marshall, Richard Nixon, Dwight Eisenhower, and George F. Kennan. George F. Kennan is the least famous of those. There are several countries we could discuss. There are 5 communist countries that threaten the West. One would be the USSR, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, as they say, the Soviet Union. Also North Korea, also East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and then Communist China. So those are 5 countries. But let's talk about 5 events, and that'll tie us back to the communist countries and the USA leaders. So we're starting here. 5 events. Let's talk about 5 events that started the Cold War or marked the beginnings of the Cold War. The first one I want to talk about is Yalta. Now, the Yalta Conference was in February of 1945, and that is when at Yalta, which is in the Crimea is that peninsula which is in the Black Sea south of Ukraine, and it's a fairly tropical climate. And at that point, the Russians controlled all that area, which they had not controlled just a year before. And the U.S. in February of 1945 was pushing into Germany after the Battle of the Bulge. And then the Brits, of course, they were our allies in the West, and the American Navy and the British Navy and other navies around the world were supplying the troops in Europe across the Atlantic, and they were fighting the war against Japan over in the Pacific. So at the Yalta Conference, you had 3 people show up. They're called the Big Three. There's Joseph Stalin, there is Winston Churchill, and there's Franklin Delano Roosevelt, also known as FDR. So looking at these people, we've got to figure out what they're looking for. Well, first, they're trying to make final plans for the war. In February 1945, the end of the war was in sight. The Germans were on the run. The German resources were spent. The Russians were advancing through Poland into toward Germany. The Americans and the British and the French and their allies in the West were advancing toward the Rhine River, and they would cross the Rhine River in April. Actually, it would be in March, April that year. So there it is. Next, the leaders want to discuss what's going to happen to Europe after the war. And Roosevelt in particular wants to talk about a United Nations. Remember, he's a Democrat. He comes as an ally of Woodrow Wilson, and just as Woodrow Wilson had ended World War I with the League of Nations, Roosevelt wants to end the war with a United Nations. And this would actually result in the signing of the United Nations Treaty in San Francisco on April the 25th of 1945. All right, now the big question of the Yalta Conference is who is going to occupy which parts of Europe, because the Americans weren't too excited about being occupiers. The Brits wanted to keep the Russians out of whatever they could keep out, and were trying to explain to the Americans that once the Russians got there, they weren't going to leave. And then the Soviets, the Russians, they wanted to occupy as much as possible and turn it into 1, communist countries. 2, they wanted to create a gigantic buffer area so that the nearest enemy to Moscow would be over 1,000 miles away. So that was the reason why they were at the conference. All righty. Now, what are the relative powers here? The U.S. is the richest country with by far the largest Navy and the largest Air Force. And it had an air force of strategic bombers that could deliver bombs thousands of miles away, or at least hundreds of miles away, over 1,000. And we had a very, very fine army on the ground in Europe. It was not anywhere close to the size of the Soviet army, which had more infantry in it than we could count. American manpower was less about infantry and more was about logistics. Americans had more people loading ships, serving on airplanes, serving in docks, serving as driving truck drivers, etc. So that's what we were doing. The Brits had the broadest power. They still had an international empire. Egypt, India, parts of Africa were all part of the British Empire. Parts of the Pacific were also in the British Empire. And then their Commonwealth nations, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, and other nations were allied to them, part of the British Commonwealth. And what Churchill wanted to do at this conference is he wanted to create or recreate and reestablish the British Empire. He did not want the British Empire to fade after this war. He did not want the British Empire to lose a war that Britain had won. Now, Franklin Roosevelt, on the other hand, he was a great American. And great Americans don't like the British Empire as a general rule. And so as a result, he didn't really care for Churchill's imperial ambitions. He eventually, late in his life, and his successor, Harry Truman, would figure out that the British Empire would be very useful and important to keep communists out of a lot of countries. And so as a result, they eventually backed off to some of the British imperial aspirations, even though Britain was not able to keep their empire as they'd hoped. Last of all, we had Joseph Stalin. And Stalin wants to control Germany and make sure Germany can never send an army to defeat Russia. That was their very purpose, more than anything else. And they were going to rush their armies and try to capture as much of Germany as possible to keep the Allies out of it if they could. All right, so that's the Yalta Conference. It didn't settle anything, except for it did appoint what became occupation zones. So essentially, the Russians would occupy everything in Germany east of the Elbe River. And the Americans and Brits and later the French would occupy everything west of the Elbe River. It also determined that in the Balkans that the Russians would occupy, say, Bulgaria, while the British would occupy Greece. So these were important decisions. It was also said, I don't know if it's true, but it's a great story, that Stalin and Churchill were drunk late one night and Churchill took out a fountain pen and a white napkin, and they divided Eastern Europe on that napkin. I don't know if that's true, but it's a great story, and it tells you how much power that Churchill and Stalin had in February 1945. And so this was also Russian hosted. It was in the Crimea, so of course the Russians made sure they gave vodka in great abundance to everybody. They also had bugs and cameras and everything they could possibly find to have intelligence on the Americans. So there was hard to find any type of security from the secret agents of the Russians. So that's event number one. Let's go to event number two. Event number two would be the Nuremberg trials. The Nuremberg trials, as far as establishing a post-war world, were vital for this reason. The three major allies, the British, the Americans, and the Russians, agreed to bring in the French also as a fourth set of judges. And those four countries would take the rounded up Nazi those charged with war crimes, high Nazi officials, everybody from Hermann Goering to Heinrich Himmler to Admiral Dönitz to Albert Speer, who was in charge of German munitions during the war. But they were going to be tried for war crimes. Now, that wasn't the Brits' plan. There was actually a memo in the British Foreign Office that suggested summary process for captured high-level Nazis. Summary process means they got a list, and if they're captured, they get shot out behind the barn, and then that way you don't have to worry about a trial and you don't have to worry about anything else. You just get rid of them and get rid of the political issues that might come up of trying to try a Nazi war criminal. So that was not British policy, but it was suggested by the British Foreign Office late in the war. Now the Russians, they didn't even think about process. The Russians wanted to round up Nazis, send them to concentration camps, and shoot the ones they hated the most. And they didn't worry about process at all. It was the Americans that we, with our great love for process, our great love for the idea that you're innocent till proven guilty. We wanted to round up the Nazi war criminals and give them trials. And Nuremberg was chosen because Nuremberg was a major center of Nazism. It was where the Nazis had their great rallies during the 1930s with all the floodlights and the flags and the parades and the bands and everything else. Is in this case, the Germans, they actually hang themselves with their own documents. The Germans, in keeping concentration camps and exterminating Jews and gypsies and whoever else they got their hands on they didn't like, the Germans kept meticulous records. They would say, we gassed so many thousand people this month. And they would often have records of their names. The Nazis had their own documents, their own meticulous record keeping. And that record keeping allowed the highest level Nazis and then several tiers down other Nazis to be successfully prosecuted and in many cases executed based on documents alone with barely anything resembling witnesses who get sworn in and testify against a particular bad guy at a concentration camp or whatever. So that was the success of the Nuremberg trials. Another success was that Robert Jackson, who was on the U.S. Supreme Court and at the time was a young and ambitious Democrat, and many people thought he might become president of the United States, he went to Germany to be the chief prosecutor. And he was the perfect man to be the point person of the prosecution. Now, he had his critics as a prosecutor, particularly British prosecutors thought he was not technically that good. But just the same, he represented this idea that the Nuremberg trials were some type of international justice done in the name of human rights and democracy. And not only that, but the Nuremberg trials declared aggressive war, that is attacking a neutral country or a friendly country next door, declared aggressive war to be a crime. And by declaring aggressive war to be a crime, they tried the leading Nazis under that criminal theory. There is a problem in legal theory under that premise. It's this. The Germans were being tried for a crime that was not on the books when the war started. In the American Constitution, they would call that an ex post facto law, which means that you're making a law against something after somebody's already done it. So you could argue that the Nazis were executed for essentially a law that wasn't a law. Now, when that was challenged to the U.S. Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court dodged the issue by essentially saying this. The Nuremberg trials in Europe, as well as the Tokyo trials in the Pacific of Japanese war criminals, were not done under Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution by U.S. judges appointed under the U.S. Constitution, but they were done by a tribunal set up under the treaty power of Article 2 of the Constitution, and if the president signed that treaty to create the Nuremberg trials and the Tokyo trials, they were under international law of the treaty, they were legitimate. But they would not have been legitimate if they'd tried to try those very things in front of a U.S. federal judge somewhere under Article 3 of the Constitution. So that's a legal point for you.